In June of this year, I read a book called The Atheist Guide to Reality by Alex Rosenberg, and in it, the author said something interesting about history. He said that when Churchill mentioned that the farther back you can look, the farther forward you can see, he was wrong. In fact, he says that there are no lessons to be drawn from history. History cannot provide predictive knowledge about the human future. We should treat the discipline of history as a source not of knowledge, but of entertainment. And finally, he said that history is bunk. Is it true? Is history bunk? Well, in some ways, I do kind of agree with him. History is kind of overrated. But in other ways, I disagree with the author when he says that studying history should only be for entertainment. So in this video, I'm going to talk about why history is and isn't bunk. And don't forget, this is a conversation, so let me know what you think in the comments down below. The main reason why history is bunk is due to arms races. The term arms race originally came from the idea of military powers building increasingly destructive weapons until one or both armies are wiped out, the most famous one being the nuclear arms race. But over time, it's become a broader term that applies whenever two entities find themselves in the same environment and start adapting in response to each other. In the animal kingdom, a good example of this would be the relationship between polar bears and seals. At first, a seal might only rely on its eyes to spot a polar bear. But after a few generations, seals, under the pressure to survive, evolved to detect the bear by smell. This leaves the polar bear with two options, either to adapt or to starve. So over time, the polar bear learns to hunt from downwind to mask its scent. Now the seal has to adapt further, maybe developing more advanced detection system or risk extinction. On and on and on until one of them becomes extinct. Arms races aren't just limited to animals, they're everywhere. Do you remember the Nigerian prince scam?
Dear sir, I am Prince Redacted from Nigeria. Your help would be very appreciated. I want to transfer all of my fortune outside of Nigeria due to a frozen account. If you could be so kind and transfer small sum of $3,500 to my account, I would be able to unfreeze my account and transfer my money outside of Nigeria. To repay your kindness, I will send $1 million to your account.
Even though this scam still pulls in around $800,000 a year, it's become less and less common. Why? Well, because people caught on. Everyone knows by now that no Nigerian prince is going to email them out of nowhere, so scammers had to get smarter and more creative. Instead of princes, now they send emails about fake refunds, payments, or shipments. And in response, governments are constantly working to educate the public about these evolving scams. You could say that there's an arms race between governments and scammers. And what's the next scam going to be? Well, there's no way to predict it. All we can do is try to stay ahead of them. We cannot use the past scams to predict future ones. Arms races happen everywhere, between viruses and your immune system, banks and hackers, and even between companies selling the same product. But why do arms races make the future unpredictable? Well, because arms races themselves are unpredictable. A biologist studying two species cannot foresee the next adaptation since it depends on random variations. And the same goes for humans. We're not that different in this regard. After all, humans are still biological creatures and thus still must follow the rules of natural selection, which are random variations and environmental filtration. Here's a quote from the book. Quote, "So the study of human history can't be any more predictively useful than the study of natural history. In fact, it has to be much less useful. Soon after the Darwinian process passed through 13.6998 billion years of evolution and arrived at us, the arms races became fast, furious, and pervasive. Nothing in human culture remains constant long enough to be relied on to forecast the future." Quote, "So humans are just way too good at adapting, so when it comes time to predict the next step in human history, we are bound to fail. Imagine if a mad scientist created an AI powerful enough to take everything into account, all the variables, events, and details of history, and could predict the future with 100% accuracy. Well, if he was the only one who knew about this AI, he might be able to cash in on the predictions. But now let's say 10 people knew about it. Now the AI would have to work even harder, not only crunching current data, but also factoring in how those predictions might influence people's actions. That means that the predictions would likely become less and less valuable. Now let's say everyone in the world knew of the predictions. Well, that would make the predictions completely useless. Because imagine if in 2005 the machine said the housing market is going to collapse in 2008. Well, you could imagine that if everyone was aware of this imminent market collapse, the market collapse would probably not have happened. The government would probably pass a law that made a very risky loans illegal, and the crisis would be averted. So, now, ask yourself, was the machine right or wrong? Because it said that there was going to be a market collapse, but in the end, it never happened. So, because everyone reacted to that prediction, the prediction never happened. So the lesson you can take away from this hypothetical situation is that the quicker a species, an entity, or an institution reacts to new environments or new information, the less stable it will be, and thus predictions made about it will be less reliable. And it's bad news for predictions about human behavior because we're really, really good at adapting. The reason we're so good at adapting is because we don't just adapt genetically. No, that's too simple. We adapt also culturally and technologically as well. We can probably predict, for example, how monkeys will behave in 100 years since they only adapt through genetics. But humans have become so intelligent and interconnected that we can adapt in any time frame we choose. A police officer can kneel on a black man's neck for 8 minutes.
What do you want? I can breathe. Please,
And this can create irreversible changes to our culture.
We begin tonight with a nation already on edge in the coronavirus pandemic as protests turn violent across America.
Black Lives Matter!
Because now we can record and share videos to the entire world in a matter of seconds. Social medias changed the way we interact with each other, and that happened in only one generation. So like the author said, nothing in human culture remains constant long enough to be relied on to forecast the future. Understanding that the past is a bad predictor for the future can help us not be fooled by our human tendency to see patterns everywhere. To better visualize it, let's look at this graph. Here, the x-axis represents time, and each dot represents an event in time. Now, if today an event happens here, because humans see patterns everywhere, someone might say, look, it was really obvious because look at how related the events that happened before are. This, however, is just an illusion, a trick that your mind plays on you. Let's say that that green dot is the event where John got fired. Now, someone might say, looking back, it was obvious that John was going to get fired because he first got divorced with his wife, he felt sad, he took a few days off of work, a few months passed where he didn't see his kids, and then he got fired. But if in an alternate universe John gets promoted, the same person will say that looking back it was obvious because he got divorced, he felt sad, took a few days off of work, went to see a therapist, had more time to work on himself and do overtime since he didn't have to take care of the kids, and finally he got promoted. Both explanations are good and compelling stories to tell, but not the truth. The problem is that it's really hard to distinguish between correlation and causation, especially for soft sciences like economics. The place where you'll see this most often is X, where armchair economists will point to any trend they can to call a recession. All you have to do to see it firsthand is just to type recession in the search bar. Now, there might be a recession coming, but people have been making the same predictions over and over again for years. So maybe there will be a recession in 2024. If not, I'm sure people will make the same predictions next year using the same erroneous thinking process. But I'm sure you won't, because now you know that the most important lesson we can derive from history is that there are not many lessons you can learn from it. Now, let's move on to why history is not bunk. The author of the book I mentioned earlier said that we should, quote, treat the discipline of history as a source not of knowledge, but of entertainment, quote. But to justify why we should treat history as such, he had to use history for purposes other than entertainment. So here's the first reason why history is important. It is important to prove that people who lean too heavily on history are mistaken. More generally, some people will use history to push their own narratives, and so the only way to push back against it is to actually know about history. A recent example is the historian that went on the Tucker Carlson show and said that Winston Churchill was the real villain of World War II.
And I told him that I think, and maybe I'm being a little hyperbolic, maybe, but I told him, maybe trying to provoke him a little bit, that I thought Churchill was the chief villain of the Second World War. Now, he didn't kill the most people, he didn't commit the most atrocities, but I believe, and I think when you really get into it and tell the story right and don't leave anything out, you see that he was primarily responsible for that war becoming what it did.
Now, I don't know much about World War II, so I won't make any strong claim. I don't know if he's right or wrong, but from the reaction that I saw from the historian community, it sounds like what he said was a load of bullshit. But some people might use this fact that Churchill was a villain to further their own movement, and the only way to push back against it is to actually study history yourself, or to rely on other experts who studied it. The second reason why history is not bunk and is actually important to learn about is because historical events can still influence today's society. You might not be able to predict the future, but to understand why things are the way they are today, you must go back in the past. The most obvious example is the reverberating effects of slavery and then segregation in the United States. Yeah, sure, some might say that slavery was abolished 160 years ago, but then these free slaves had to start building wealth. And not only were they penniless, but they also faced obstacles like exploitative sharecropping contracts, redlining, and segregation. And it's not like those obstacles were only present in the first 20 years after slavery was abolished. In 1959, because the Prince Edward County didn't want to desegregate their schools, they closed down their entire public school system, leaving most black children without schooling for 5 years, and some of those children are still alive today. Another example is the Indian Act in Canada. It basically removed most rights to the First Nations and treated them like children in the eyes of the law. Some of those rights were given back in 1951 and others in 1985. So, in the country you live in, if you look around, you'll likely see certain groups facing challenges, protesting, or trying to have their voices heard. And to truly understand their struggles, to truly understand if it's justified or not, you need to know their history. Without understanding the historical context, it's difficult to come up with solutions that address the root of the problem. The same applies to conflicts between populations or nations. If you don't understand the reason behind the conflict, it's hard to find a solution both sides would be willing to accept. And the third reason why I think history is not bunk is that it helps you understand what is possible and possibly can allow you not to make the same mistake twice. For example, I'm currently reading a book about consciousness called Being You, and the author argues that we shouldn't be too quick to say that consciousness is impossible to understand or irreducible because in the past we made a similar mistake with the concept of life itself. Back then, biologists and others studying the body didn't really understand what separated living things from non-living things. The only thing they knew is that one's alive and one is not. So they hypothesized that there must be something beyond mechanical properties, a kind of life force that living beings had and non-living things didn't. They said things like, whoa, life is way too complex, and so it would be impossible to explain it without relying on an immaterial force. In the 18th and 19th century, there were debates between two groups, the vitalists, who believe in this life force, and the physicalists, or whatever they call themselves, who believed life could be fully explained through physical processes. And today, despite vitalists saying that it would be impossible to explain life, vitalism is now considered a pseudoscience, and most biologists agree that the emergence of life can be explained without invoking any immaterial force. How did we reach this conclusion? Well, by improving our technologies and gathering more evidence. But, of course the vitalists thought that way because they couldn't fathom the kind of technology we have today, just like we cannot fathom the kind of technology we'll have in 100 years. So, although the problem of consciousness and the question of how life emerges are different, we can learn from history that just because it's hard to imagine explaining consciousness using only physical mechanisms, it doesn't mean it's impossible. This ties back to what I mentioned earlier. We shouldn't be too quick to assume that consciousness is beyond explanation simply because the future is unpredictable. We don't know what discoveries might be made next year or in 10 years. We can only make guesses, but we can never be certain. And history will not guide us in predicting those discoveries. But it does remind us not to be overly confident in our assumptions about the future. So, why is history bunk? Well, because natural selection makes arms races possible. That means that we cannot use past adaptations to predict future ones. The reason why we cannot predict arms races is because natural selection works by environmental filtration and random variations. And because humans are not excluded from natural selection, any past events cannot be predictive of future ones. And also because humans not only adapt genetically, but also culturally and technologically, any constant in human history will be very short-lived and ever-changing. Now, why is history not bunk? Well, because it can help us counter misinformation, can help us understand why things are the way they are in the present, and it can help us learn from our mistakes by not being overly confident about the future. So, it is true that Churchill was wrong, because although history shouldn't be just considered entertainment, that doesn't mean that the farther back we can look, the farther forward we can see. It's actually the opposite. The farther back we can look, the less confident we should be about how far forward we can see.